webinar, more detail on our level being webinar 9 mastery more detail on our level being 9 mastery program. Wow! Mastery program. Level being 9 mastery.
Recording is on.
Professor Kritsky, welcome to You Learn Naturally Radio again. Thank you for sharing a moment with us to explore further ancient Egypt and beekeeping, the beekeeping practice of ancient times. In this episode, in this conversation, I'd like to focus in a bit more on the hieroglyphs. We did touch on it in the introduction, and you kindly explored many things in that introduction from the beginnings. Mm-hmm. But your work is, as I said before, very well documented, and I'd like to just hear a bit more about your findings regarding particularly the bee-related hieroglyphs, and obviously the context in which they're in, and what you glean from it, and even just some of your maybe personal stories around when you found those things.
Sure.
Yeah.
Oh, very good.
Before you do share that, I would just say this. When I went to Luxor, I was very touched by what looked like renovation on ancient buildings, and the bits of renovation were falling off. You've obviously seen this kind of thing. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it was very disturbing to me that someone was trying to fix up something, and even that thing's just falling off the old thing. And obviously in the process of doing that, the people who are fixing up, if you're going to try and fix a thing and you can't make it stick, then probably you may not even be shaping it in the right way, defining it in principle. So It left me very, very concerned. And maybe you can share a word on this as well.
Oh, it does me as well. One of the most important beekeeping scenes is a painted scene at the tomb of Rekhmare that was produced in the 18th dynasty. And it's a beautiful painted scene. And it's very complete. And it shows workmen taking honeycomb out of the horizontal hives. And they're crushing it and putting it in big containers and what have you. And then they're pouring things into amphora, and then eventually sealing them into these wonderful bowls, sealed on top of other bowls as a unit of sale. And one of the things I found very disturbing. I've been to that site now 4 times. It's beautiful. Is that in the original work by Newbery, and there are close-ups of the various scenes, and in there are little sketches of bees. And I examined several of these locations. When you walk into the tomb, immediately off to your right, you see all these tributes being paid to the pharaoh. And next to some of them, they have a little honeybee. And that honeybee with the amphora container and the last line is the word for honey. So it tells us it was honey that was in there. Those little sketches are gone. And I talked to colleagues of mine who are Egyptologists working in Luxor. They said when they cleaned that tomb many, many years ago, a lot of those were actually cleaned off. Oh. And so fortunately we have Newbery's little sketches and what's in there. But we don't have, it's not there anymore. And one area is really high up into the ceiling. So I went with binoculars. And I had permission to photograph. So we were taking really good quality photographs. And I was, looking at these things with binoculars, trying to find, is it still there? And I couldn't find it. Very disappointing in that sense. So I know it's now. On the other hand, there are other tombs, such as the tomb of Medu, where the cleaning was just pristine, just beautiful, gorgeous things. The colors just pop. Everything is there that we see in the original field notes. It's just it looks like it was painted last week. They didn't go in and recreate things. They just cleaned off a lot of the surface dirt and what have you, but they didn't destroy anything. And it's just beautiful job with that. So it's to see the two extremes was made me feel good for the future, where we're doing good techniques now, but sad at what happened over the decades of the past.
So you feel generally that things are improving in that regard?
I think so, definitely. And there's a lot of this. I think it's hard. It's hard to go back and criticize things that happened 150 years ago. But you look at before the Carter found Tut's tomb. People like Davis, for example, just go in there and collect it. They didn't really do a lot of detailed photography. There was a lot of that work was being done for sale and what have you. When King Tut was found, that was Howard Carter and his team. It took 10 years to go through all that, and they carefully photographed everything in situ, where it was in the tomb from all angles. Took it out, carefully photographed it again, made notes on what they were seeing, what have you, because this was. This is the first time it's ever been done. In that sense, it changed archaeology in that regard. And so that was the 1920s. So to see things that were found in the 1890s that were not handled properly, it's not surprising. It's sad, but that's the state of the science of the time.
Yeah, I hear you. I hear you. I mean, we're going. Maybe I don't want to go too far off where we're going, but now that we're sort of talking about the review of the temples as it is now, I heard that they had recently found a whole new set of artifacts. Have you had a chance to get a review of that? Do they send out the documentation of these new findings so that people can see what's on them?
The new finds, I think you're talking about the burials at Saqqara. Yes. The large number of coffins, beautiful. Some of the stuff's just amazing. Nothing has been formally published yet. So the only thing I've been able to review or see are the photographs that were taken at the press conference, for example. There's now a special 1 hour or 2 hour, I think it's a 2 hour program that's airing on Netflix, for example, on the finds. Which is a really good example of archaeology and the way it should be done properly. They had a forensic anthropologist, they had archaeologists, and how they coordinated the site. Excavating very carefully, bringing things out for analysis, what have you. But nothing's been formally published yet. I'm sure the Honey Bee Hieroglyphs are there in a few places. You see them at other tombs at Saqqara. In fact, when you walk to the tomb of Meru, before you even walk in, the door jamb actually has a big bee right next to the door. So I'm sure they'll be there.
So what would be the process then for you? Is that something, would they notify different scholars around things that they know they're interested in? Or is it just an open day when it becomes more accessible to more people?
It varies. A lot of whoever has the concession and for that find, it's up to them to actually bring in the specialists they want to bring in. Right. Normally, I'm not an Egyptologist by training, so I'm not going to be part of that group. But I have made it a point and been very fortunate to have. I remember talking with some of my colleagues at the Valley of the Kings right after they found that cache of burial materials from Tut's burial, and I was talking with. There were some parts of coffins in there as well, and I was talking with the lead archaeologist, and my involvement in that was to look at what was causing the damage, the insect damage in some of the wood products. I also have been sent some photographs, for example, that have little bits of silk stuck to the walls where spiders had been producing egg sacs and what have you. That's been most recent involvement of these, is the application of entomology, looking at termites or if not termites, then silverfish going in and feeding off of organic matters in the tomb, mostly for the damage insects caused as opposed to the hieroglyphs.
Okay.
But it's nice to be able to get to see that and get in there to see that and hear about it and what have you.
It's an angle. Do you find, is there any do creatures basically just consume everything about, or do they have a way of consuming that sort of leaves some new kind of evidence, like a wax molding type of thing?
It varies what you're looking at. So, for example, at Amarna, the city that Akhenaten built, we find pieces of dried bread with beetle borings in them that were being consumed by, and we find even parts of the insects. We have found a flea We have found the part of a bed bug. We have found a number of stored grain pests at some of the digs at Amarna. And so it's interesting to see that the same pest that we worry about now was present there. There are, I think that there is an example of some dried bread. I believe it's at the British Museum that I've seen from their online catalog that show the borings in of stored grain pests feeding on the grain on the bread and what have you. So we see that we don't have a good word for mosquito. Because we're not talking about entomologists. There was they did have a word for beetle and a word for bee, and so the hieroglyph for a grasshopper could mean a grasshopper, as we see in some of the tombs that are showing scenes of the idyllic scenes of the afterlife. But they also use that to represent soldiers or a battalion or a number of individuals in an army, for example. Mm-hmm. And that's not surprising because you'd see that the locusts that they were familiar with came in swarms, plagues, and so that'd be like an army coming in. And so to use a symbol of a grasshopper for that is not surprising.
Yeah, I get you. I mean, this is why we alluded to it before, but I'm interested in the metaphors that go around the bee and the scarab as well. I have some sense of this as well, and my general sense is that there are different layers of conversation. There are functional ways of conversing with the hieroglyph, and then there's poetry. There's and there's maybe metaphysical. You could say metaphysical conversation, or philosophical conversation. So I'm interested in how all of that is unpacked, and especially in regard to the bees, how you find that, what you make of the hieroglyphs, what others have made of it, and perhaps you can tell us a bit more. Like I said, I'm thoroughly enjoying the book. My pace is a bit slowed down for going through it, but I am going through it, and so I'd like to, if you don't mind, I think it will help my beloved listeners to sort of reference some of the images that you have, because they're very revealing, and they're a good gateway in, and you have the story, because I can see a lot of these images. You're the photographer, so you're taking primary evidence of these things, and as we were just saying, sometimes these things can get wiped away. It's like that.
In many cases, so for example, when I go to the British Museum, and I'm hoping to return once this COVID issue is settled a little more, and I've already got my first jab, so I'm anxiously waiting for my second so I can come over. To me, it's how I take notes in many cases. One of the nicest things that's happened in the last 10 years is the iPhone. I can take the iPhone and literally lay it on a cabinet, and and it'll take this photograph that's pristine, and I can see minute detail so I'm not just taking notes on what I'm seeing, and I might have a different recollection later. I can actually photograph the original that I can blow up to life size and study it further. And in looking at the Honey Bee Hieroglyph, the wonderful thing about the British Museum is that they've got that whole range of things that show how it evolved. Going back to about 3000 BC, you see these very crudely drawn figures. Some of them, for example, look like are an oval with a pointed end, and the wings are going to be these little loops. Nothing very careful. 2 antennae off the tip, and 3 little lines to the legs. Very crudely written, but yet we also see on some of these. There's one in particular from that was published by Petrie in 1900 that shows the royal titulary. This is back around 3000 BC. So we're looking here at a honeybee, the sedge plant, and 2 half circles underneath it. That's what we see going from this time all the way through Egyptian history until the hieroglyphs cease. And that, again, is in the very first and second dynasties. It's very crudely drawn. And then by the third dynasty, at the Step Pyramid at Saqqara and at the museum there, there is the base of a statue to Zoser, and you see this beautifully carved honeybee that's the style that you'll see running for the next couple thousand years. Mm-hmm. And it becomes a little more carefully drawn entity, and even so much as I'm looking at figure 7.3 of the book, where you can see the bees facing each other. They're almost mirror images. You'll see on this is page 68. If you've got the book with you, you'll notice at the top there's a large Dejid pillar, which is that sort of large thing with the 4 lines at the very top, and there's a bee on to the left of it, and there's a bee facing it to the right. Mm-hmm. And you can see that the bee that's just to the left of the Dejid pillar, next to it is a plant. That's the sedge plant, the sedge, and then the half circle is directly below it. That's the royal titulary, and we have that intact.
Can you explain that a bit more? The royal titulary, what does that mean?
This was a after a king's name or a pharaoh's name. You always find these 4 symbols, and in Egyptian it's been Nezubiti. It stood for King of Upper and Lower Egypt, where the plant is a representative of Southern Egypt, and the bee represented the Delta region. And so when you find that usually, and if you look at page 69, you'll see there's Ramses's cartouche, and next to it there's the big bee and the plant, and then the 2 half circles outside of the cartouche. And you'll find that associated with all, in many places, you'll see that hundreds of times. You go to Luxor Temple, for example, I stopped counting it at 100. It's everywhere, it seemed like. And that basically states in this case, the bee represents the Delta region. And we're not entirely sure why. It makes logical sense. It says it's going to have a lot more moisture. The flowers and plants will be more dense. You might see bees naturally occurring there in larger numbers. That's the general idea behind it. When translated directly, that royal titulary is he of the sedge and the bee. And then if you read what's written on the Rosetta Stone in Greek right after the name Ptolemy, it says King of Upper and Lower Egypt. So it's it's clear that that's associated with sort of an honorific of that. It's like today they'd say Your Royal Highness. Mm-hmm. So it's a title that would go along with the name.
Okay.
And so the use of the bee is you'll find the bee used in a number of ways. Number one, it's going to be used just as a syllable for a word, a bit. You can also find it used in words that represent things that are bee related. The most common form of this is, and this is on page 70 of the book, is if you have the word for bee, and that's the bee hieroglyph with a half circle and that dowel or that straight line, and that tells you that what that hieroglyph is means what it symbolizes, a bee. Mm-hmm. Now, to get the word honey, you take the bee that have and that half circle is the consonant t for tea. Put a vessel with it and those 3 lines, and that means honey. And so if you go and look at what we saw at the solar temple of Nesrayani in figure 2.5 on page 13, you'll see there's a bee, a half circle, and the individual sealing in that vessel. You've got the word for honey there as well. Beekeeper, which is pretty cool. You can see it in several ways. You'll see the honeybee, half circle, and a man or figure next to him with 2 sliding lines. That man could be either standing or kneeling. And that's interpreted as beekeeper. So you can see all so honey, bee, and beekeepers all use the bee, the half circle. So a man with a bee, beekeeper makes sense, in this sense, in that interpretation. Then we have things.
Is that pattern? Have you noted that pattern applied to other keepers of other things, keepers of other livestock?
I've not really gone into a lot of those others other than except for beekeeping. But yes, you do see that. You'll find in some instances talking about beer brewing, you'll find figures associated with that for brewer, for example. So again, the neat thing about hieroglyphics is you've got over 700 of these symbols, and putting them together in different combinations, and then you've got some even. It's a rich language, and I've often wondered, and I've been working. One of the things that we have at Mount St. Joseph University is one of the top reading science programs in the United States, and I'm really keen on the idea of studying. Okay, we read, and I can see Black Open University behind you, for example. I can see, I can read that, and that there's a meaning to that. We have 26 letters, and within that we have all our communications, and we think of, and we have the way we think is tied into what we read. You've got over 700 hieroglyphs, and these hieroglyphs include consonant sounds like T is the half circle is T. But we also have biliterals, and those are symbols that represent two sounds, like sh, shh. That's a biliteral, and then we have triliterals, symbols that represent three sounds, like kefir. That's and symbolized by the beetle, the scarab beetle, and so you'll find the scarab beetle in names and words. A great example of that is in the part of the name of Tutankhamun. As you can see here, I'll show you here. You can see it here. It's Neb Kefru Ra, and so it's Tutankhamun Neb Kefru Ra is the full name, and right in the middle, there's your beetle, and so that's triliteral as part of that name. And if you look at let's see, who else do we have? We could put in here. It's not a complete listing, but you'll see his the pharaoh before him, Neb Kefru Ra Spentkara. So it's a name that you'll find in some cases it's running through families, but so you'll find that those are triliterals. So you've got consonants, biliterals, triliterals. And then you can actually put together words that include those sounds, but then almost like a rebus would have the sound of the name of a structure could be part of that name as well. So Neb Kefru Ra. It's not saying that King Tut was a beetle. That's the triliteral in the middle of his name. And so that's it's really quite a fascinating language, and to me what it is it's a complex language. So in describing the world with a language that's got that many symbols, is that going to change how we think about it? And that I pose for you is: you have a smartphone? You have an iPhone?
I don't have an iPhone, but
you have a Droid. You have a Droid.
Yeah.
Okay. Do you use emojis?
Yes, sometimes.
And that's what's going on in hieroglyphics. You've got you type a word. You might type a name, and then you put in like I see you. You have the letter I, and then maybe the emoji of the two eyeballs, and the letter U. That's using a image. The emoji is like a picture. It's like those 600 other hieroglyphs symbols out there that we're combining into letters, symbols, words, numbers, and already it's going to be interesting to see how our language evolves with this. This essentially we're evolving back towards a hieroglyphic language.
I agree. I very much agree. And the reason I'm so very interested in the language is because our system of teaching, the pedagogy, we have approach called unified knowledge language, and that basically involves valuing hand signing as well as valuing ways to convert words into drum patterns with a logical way of translating that. As well as obviously script, and the script we use is the one from Ethiopia. Now that script the holders of it, they claim it's over 2,000 years old. So it's got a very deep history. And because it's a syllabary, it connects to some of the ancient words that I've seen and come to know from Kemet. So even some of the meanings, they correspond in a very interesting way. So that whole palette of language together brings up a different way of thinking about how to communicate things. But you see, when you mentioned the Kepra, the scarab beetle, in the name, what comes to my mind is about the nature of the beetle, what it's famous for in terms of wrapping its young in dung and allowing them to have a space to come forth to regenerate. This principle of regeneration. I have that sense that it's related to this. So when it's in a name, to me, that's my natural sense that they're alluding to some transformational power that they feel this person has or is about.
And that's that's currently possible in the case of although in addition to that, these beetles, this dung that they wrap their young in, their eggs in, is rolled on the ground. And so if you go down to the Valley of the Kings, you'll find instances where the goddess Nut eats the sun at sundown and gives birth to the sun in the morning, and that sun is moved across the sky by the beetle god Kefru. And there's a general sense that the action, as you just said, the action of the animal in nature is symbolic of what the animal does in Egyptian religion. And so the beetle is the force that moves the sun god across the sky because of that they look. And I've been to the pyramids many times, and I've actually found beetles around the pyramids rolling balls of dung. I've seen that. It's really quite amazing. It's sort of like whoa, and so we look to what the animals do in nature. The ibis, for example, with that curved bill, is associated with the goddess Thoth, and Thoth, and that curved bill, the way that ibis dips it into the water looking for food, is symbolic of the scribe or Thoth dipping his pen in the inkwell to record the weighing of the heart in the case of the judgment of the heart to go into the afterlife, or just as a record keeper, because Thoth is thought to be the inventor of hieroglyphs, for example. So to understand any animal or any insect in particular, I've actually tried to look at what does it do in relation in nature, and how might that have an impact on its meaning. One example that's of an idea that I've proposed, although it's not widely accepted by I think a lot of Egyptologists, it may be for a lot of it, is the click beetle. We have a few reliefs of the click beetle associated with the goddess Neith, and she's also symbolized as a female with with arrows and bows and what have you. And if you've ever handled click beetles, they'll click their thorax as a way to get away from enemy. It's snapping sound. And there's a snapping sound. Why is that associated with things like archery? Well, when you release the arrow, there is a snapping sound that sends the arrow. That may be more symbolic why she's associated with the click beetle than the idea that it's on the shore of the Nile, and as the waters rise or popping away. I've never seen that. I've collected click beetles for going on 40 years now, and I've seen click beetles all over the world. And they tend to avoid predation as opposed to they'll right themselves with that. So that's one that's quite intriguing to me as well. But to really get a good sense of the symbolic importance, we need to understand the full behavior of the animal as well. And it has to be a behavior that's it. And you were talking, and I agree with the idea of taking language and coupling it with since we've been talking, both of us have been using our hands.
Yes.
It adds another whole dimension to communication. the spoken word along with the written word, in this case with hieroglyphs and emojis or whatever, and then combine that with gestures, helps us convey meaning.
See, my sense, I mean, there's a couple of things in what you're saying that I'm very interested in. The one before the one I'm going to talk about, do you have a sense that where you've seen the bee hieroglyphs, you can see some relationship to the nature of bees? Is it, do you see differently from simply saying this is a beekeeper, or the letter B is inside of the term that's being referenced, those two things? Do you see that other level of somehow this is reflecting the nature of bee life?
Well, one of the things that you see that's quite intriguing is a lot of when the Honey Bee Hieroglyph was first described by a number of individuals, by Petrie, and I think that, let me double check to make sure my association is going to be ideal in this. That when it was first looked at, there was a lot of discussion as to whether it was really a bee, and even just in the last years, it was Budge and listed the bee hieroglyph as bee or hornet with a question mark, because the antennae are way too long, as to be a bee. Bees have a different shape to the antennae, whereas you look at these things, the shape of those antennae don't look honeybee-like at all. The abdomen seems to be really big in consideration, so it does have a very hornet-like appearance. And so the question is, was it a bee or was it a hornet? And in reality, we know it's supposed to be a bee because it's associated with the word honey. Now, what that tells me is one of two things. Most likely is that the people drawing the bee and the hieroglyph were not beekeepers. I have had a lot of people tell me this bee is coming at me, and it was a wasp. I've had people have refer to bees as wasps. I've had wasps referred to as bees. And so I think what we're seeing is that this flying, stinging insect that people see, and these scribes weren't necessarily sitting next to beehives. So what are they looking at? What's the biggest thing you'll see that's like a bee? Is really a wasp. So it could be they were basing it on a wasp, but they were using it for the word honey. So it clearly was designed, created to represent a true bee. In many cases, we find you'll find bees and wasps in the same area, especially if there's not a lot of water sources nearby. You'll find them together, not necessarily at the same, doing the collecting honey and what have you, but they're feeding on water sources and what have you. Do you see a lot of wasps or pollinators like bees? So I think that what we're looking at is not that these were not taxonomists. They did not understand the difference between Polistes and the genus Apis. They, however, were drawing something that belongs to the insect order Hymenoptera, which includes the bees, wasps, and ants and things like that. That brings a lot of questions to me, more questions, because I get the idea that the position of the scribe is very sacred, like the beekeeper. Evidently, from your work, the beekeeper is a sacred role, or a role close to the nobles of the time. And so for the scribe to, especially with that first quote that you gave in our first conversation about the beginnings and the tears of Ray, and if indeed the people of ancient Egypt held bees in such high regard, then I would have thought that it would be a terrible thing for a scribe to not do it properly, to mistake it for another thing. But that's a different conversation. But it's, you look at the what was going on in ancient Greece and other areas. How many kids mix up a moth for a butterfly? And it's not that it's the juvenile are an ignorant thing. If you're not trained in entomology, which they weren't at the time, they had a few. They talked about a few insects, but you don't find a word that separates a fly from a mosquito. For example, you got this biting thing or stinging thing, but there's not a word that's clear of what we're trying to get at. It could be used for other things. For example, bees were also called the flies of honey. And there's a hieroglyph of the fly, which is associated with the fly of honey, which also meant bee.
Hmm.
And so in this case, any flying insect could have been associated with bees.
Okay.
And that doesn't mean they were doing something incorrect, I think, as much as that's the state of the knowledge of insect diversity at the time.
I hear you. Okay. Yeah,
there were several,
get you.
Yeah, several thousand insect species in Egypt, and we have we're looking at probably no more than half a dozen that's going to be commonly used.
Did you find the other question I had in mind is, did you find anything like songs or poetry or some hymn? I gather that there's some hieroglyphic text that suggests itself to be a kind of ode or an utterance, a hymn like this. Did you find anything like that had bee-related matter?
I did not survey the literature thoroughly for things like that, so I've not seen any kind of thing that would refer to the word honey in a sweet sense, like we use honey as a pronoun for another individual, for example. There are hymns, but I've not, as I said, I've not delved into that literature. For that, my focus has always been on the beekeeping.
Right. Okay.
Level being 9, more detail mastery. On our level being level 9, mastery program. Detail on level 9, mastery program. Wow! Mastery program. Level being 9, mastery.
Okay, that's interesting. That's very interesting. Okay, cool. It's very. There's a lot in it. There's a lot in your story. So maybe if you could. I did say I wanted to hear something more personal from your like a situation when you've just seen something. I was just touched by you seeing the scarab beetle, the Kepler, doing its stuff in the middle of a temple. That's kind of classic. So, but yes, things like this. These are things many of our audience may not have travelled to Egypt to see these things, and even if they go now, they're not likely to see the kind of detail that you can see, or even that I saw when I went. The times I've been, when I've gone back, it's very different, and it just leaves me very concerned. So I feel it for people now who go, because I can imagine it's like having a shoddy plastering job done. That's what I'm imagining it's like. But anyway, but to hear actual first-hand stories of when you see things, when you've discovered something or you've come across something, maybe you can share a story like this.
Certainly. I have always been intrigued by how the carving of hieroglyphs, for example. And in the book, I talk about how there's a grid pattern. Typically what would happen if on a temple wall, or in some cases a pharaoh's tomb wall, but not necessarily in a nobleman's wall. It varies from on rank and what have you. A grid pattern would be created, usually grid lines, created by taking string, and much like when you're putting up wallpaper, and you have the plumb bob, that sort of chalk string on a weight at the end, and you put it up against it and you snap it against the wall, get that straight, your first line. You'll see lines like that, probably created a similar way in ancient Egypt, forming a grid pattern. And they knew what they want. They would then draw the relief out on a piece of pottery, broken pottery, and then looking at that and we have pottery with the grids on it, so they know how to, as they draw to the larger squares, they can enlarge that image over the whole relief. And I've seen these grid patterns in several places, and I've been very much interested in the idea of how the Honey Bee hieroglyph was related to that grid pattern. And it was I've got this in the book. The cartouche was a 2x4 rectangle, and the next to it was a 2x2, basically a grid with just 4 squares with an intersection in the middle. And the most perfect bees I've ever seen are drawn in such a way that the intersection, that line through the middle of the square, that where the intersection occurs, would be tangential to the back of the bee, the thorax, and being bisected by that line to be the forewing, going straight up to the ending at the tip of the grid. The hindwing would start at the middle intersection of the squares in the middle of the 4 squares, and then end up right at the corner to the upper lift. The thorax body would be just below the that intersection of the grid, and the abdomen would be in the lower quarter, just touching the tip of where the stinger would be, right at the edge of the grid line. This is on figure 711 in my book, and that's just a beautiful way of drawing this. So what I did was I went to Luxor Temple. I went to the Tomb of Pabasa, which is a very famous beekeeping site in Luxor. And
say that place again.
The Tomb of Pabasa. It's Pabasa. It's got one of the most famous beekeeping reliefs. Probably the most widely photographed relief is there. And then I also went to the Ramesseum, and I started photographing. I think I must have taken several hundred photographs of every bee hieroglyph I could find. And I noticed that there was I'm trained as an alpha taxonomist. I study insect evolution. That's what I did my PhD work on, and I'm very focused on variation. Darwin talked about how it's impossible to draw a clear line of demarcation between individual variation, subspecies, species, genera, and so on. And so I focus on slight differences. And I took all these photographs, and then back at the lab, I literally superimposed the grid over the royal titulary. And I found that some like I just described were perfect, with the forewing being bisected by that middle line and the hindwing touching the corner. I saw some though that had the forewing in the first not being bisected but forward, and the hindwing being also forward. Variation like that, and that intrigued me. And so I started comparing things. So let's use the Ramesseum as an example. There's a series of columns, and at the base of all the columns, there's the royal titulary. And the bees on those columns are very different from all the other bees in the rest of the temple, but they're almost identical to each other. And so I started thinking, well, how do you analyze things like this? Well, I happen to have a very good colleague at the university who's a forensic anthropologist, forensic scientist, and I got some references from her on handwriting analysis, and found that indeed there are certain ways that that people who study handwriting analysis could say, yes, that was signed by the same person or not. And so I looked at those parameters and applied it to the grid pattern on these hieroglyphs at the Ramesseum. And the ones at the base of the temple, at the base of the columns, those were clearly all drawn by the same individual. Now, how that works is before a surface was prepared for the relief or the painting, a grid pattern would be put up. It would be checked by a master scribe, and then another scribe would come in and do the finished work. And they'd either remove the red by painting over it or plaster over it or what have you, or and remove the grid, but not always. Clearly, the scribe, either the master scribe who approved it or the scribe themselves, they created the same grid pattern in every single one of these column bases. You go about 25 yards out of that area and around the corner, and here's other bees. You look at those, and they don't even fit the same pattern of the bees on the base of the columns. And so you put the grid pattern in there. You find very different patterns. Clearly, they were done by a different individual. So either the master scribe approved a different pattern, But we start seeing that kind of variation from one place. It took from one place to the next. It took probably 20 years to build this pyramid, this temple. So therefore, it's not surprising you might have different people over time doing this. But it was rather neat. To me, it was the hidden hand of the scribe. The hidden hand that you don't, so I look at these bees and I'm now thinking not of the bee. I'm thinking of the person who's drawing the bee. And what he was doing in setting that up within the pattern, the grid pattern, and making it fit. There were other places in the Ramesseum where they literally ran out of room for the bee. And so then they just discarded the whole grid altogether. Instead of having the abdomen come out straight like you normally would see, or just slightly curved down, this thing was curved almost 90 degrees down because they ran out of space. So much like you would do on an exam paper, you're writing away and you got to get, and you're getting closer to the end of the page and just make it smaller and smaller. Or when you're taking notes when you were in school and you're taking notes and you get to the end of the line, but you start writing down the side of the paper instead of going to the next line if you're running it, that type of a thing. And then on granite statues, which are going to be very important, those bees are almost mirror images of each other. They're beautifully carved. They fit that grid pattern exactly. And so that was quite intriguing to see that kind of consistency on those statues. Now, probably that statue is carved somewhere else, not even at the temple, possibly. But again, when you see these, what impresses upon me are the number of people that were involved with doing this, and as I refer to it as the hidden hand, because every one of those bees was carved by a human being, and the one dude working out where the columns were is very different from the guy that was around the corner.
Yeah, I see that. Okay, that's interesting. It's very interesting.
And in contrast, at the tomb of Babasa, which is a beautiful location. I mentioned it's one of those widely illustrated scenes. There's the tomb.
Right.
You'll see that. Those bees were all drawn freehand. There's no grid pattern that works at all to them. So it looked like whoever carved those literally went in and probably did one after the other rather rapidly. And there's a lot of variation, not the precision, no evidence of a grid there. This was not a pharaoh or a higher ranking. It was a ranking individual, but not like you'd see. In fact, they had the tomb. Obviously, he had some status, but a very different process. Also, a very different dynasty. That's the 26th dynasty. So it's going to be a very different time period and patterns.
Do you, as you've mentioned the dynasties, do you have a general overview I mean, you've touched on it in your book. Maybe you can just share your thoughts about the kind of detail or the kind of value of bees and the bee hieroglyphs presence in different dynasties, different eras of ancient Egyptians' heritage.
Well, if you look at there's two ways to look at that. One, looking at the hieroglyphs themselves. So we see, for example, between 3000 and 2850 BCE, there's a very crude sort of carving of the bee hieroglyphs. We have in the third dynasty, 2687 to 2649 BCE. Then we got our first really pristine hieroglyphs, and they stay pretty close, that pattern, all through the rest of the Old Kingdom, the first intermediate period into the Middle Kingdom, second intermediate period, and so on. Once we get into the time of the Ptolemies, back in the time of Cleopatra and earlier, then we start seeing some really very interesting and strange variations to the hieroglyphs. If you start, this is you'll see the perfect bee, but then when you get down into for example, at Kom-Ombo, which is a Ptolemaic temple, we don't have the bees with the wings going the same direction. The wings are almost like a V shape. Very strange. And indeed, we'll see a bee at Philae, Philae, that you got lines drawn in. It looked like veins on the wing veins. And then when you get to the Roman era, such as Kalabsha temple, the abdomen is very distinct. It's carved with a strange internal proximal shape that's up against the abdomen, very different from the others. The wings are flaring off in each direction. So it's clear that the at least in Kalabsha, the care that to have to follow from the old kingdom and the earlier dynasties is not being followed very carefully.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Okay.
And that's not surprising. Look at how our handwriting has evolved over the years, and so
this is it. And then the disregard for some traditions and old cultures. Yeah,
yep.
It's interesting how you can read that through the writing on the wall, the writings on the wall.
No pun intended.
No pun intended. No. Okay, that's cool.
But one story I should tell you, because it relates to the beetle thing that we were touching about.
Okay.
I was teaching at Minya University, teaching entomology, and I had some students bring in some large scarab beetles, and they were clearly, these were. I mean, we're talking about things the size of a bigger than a 2-pound coin.
Mm-hmm.
And they were the biggest beetles I had seen. Now the ones I collected around the pyramids were smaller than that. And I thought, well, that's kind of cool. This is really it. So where'd you get them? And they told me they got them at the village that you would stop and get the boat to go across the Nile to go to Amarna. And I was taking a colleague to go see the Amarna archaeological site. And I said, so what do you call these? They said Goron. And I thought, all right. So I wrote it down phonetically. And when I got to as soon as I got there, I was swarmed by kids. And I would say Ondak Goron. And basically I was saying I want a big beetle. When I come back, I try to my best Arabic, which is not that good. When I come back, I'll buy some of these big beetles. I got back, and not a single. They all had something to sell me, but it wasn't a beetle. They were fossil sea urchins, which are just as exciting to me as the beetle, because I have also done a lot of work on paleontology. I've written a book on dinosaurs and things like that. So I was thrilled, even though it wasn't what I was expecting.
How did they make that? How did with a word, another word, a similar word for that?
Apparently, that's not a similar word. What I asked for was this large artifact. And so it was, they were, I thought I was talking, and I was trying to use the word, inside things I was trying to get it a grid, but they didn't disappoint me by any means. It was just, I thought that was one of my favorite days I had, because first of all, I liked working with the kids. That was a lot of fun, and they were excited that and this is a location when I was there that wasn't visited very often, and so for us to show up was exciting, and it was a great day. It was I had a great time visiting the archaeological site, the tombs, but then to all of a sudden end up that I got fossil sea urchins from the Oligocene period, 35 million years ago. I didn't expect that.
Do you, regarding the people in Egypt, do you feel that they have, what kind of relationship do they have to the heritage that's there? I mean, obviously, tourism, I guess, when I was there, tourism just dominated the space. But is there something outside of serving tourists and visitors that they have? I mean, I recall a whole area of sellers of perfume, and with stories of their lineage in the perfume, and it seemed like good quality to me, but I'm not a professional for that. But they were trying to tap into that, I think. But do you feel that there are people there that feel really connected to the heritage?
Oh, I definitely. There's no question about it. If you think back just a few years ago, when they had when the Hardy building was firebombed next to the Cairo Museum, there were people that held hands surrounding the Egyptian museum to stop it from being looted.
Mm.
I mean, because that's not, and even the few artifacts that were stolen, many of them have come back. Not all, but some of them have come back. I remember there was a story that one of the statues or wooden carvings from the Tut exhibit that was taken was actually found on the subway in a bag, just sitting there. Somebody brought it in, walked in there, and wanted to return it, but they didn't want to. But the stories that my colleagues told me about how people, where the demonstration was going on, literally held hands surrounding the museum to stop it from being looted. I mean, and of course, it's not just Egyptian history. That's human history. That's our history, your history, and my history.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so I was quite touched by that. I remember taking my students when I was teaching there to Tuna Gebel, which is an underground necropolis, and I took them back to this sarcophagus way down one of the tunnels and everything else, and they knew that the site was important. They got a big kick out of how excited I was about the site, because it's a little bit like, I mean, when was the last time I went down to see the changing of the guard at Buckingham Palace? Have you ever done that?
I haven't. I've been around when it's happening.
But you didn't go there intentionally to do it.
No.
And that's the way it is. Yeah. People never feel that same connection like tourists will when they come in. The students had been there before. They'd seen them, but they never went and explored some of the sites. Not like they didn't care. But I'm happy to say that my students were quite enthusiastic to get to go back into these areas. A lot of times because I was able to get. It may have been I got them all passes to get into there. It might have been the first time that happened, but you tend not to go visit places that are right next door.
Yeah, that's true.
I mean, it's when I was living in Cambridge, my wife and I used to take the train down to London every other weekend, practically, and we go back to the same places. It's like I could never get enough of the British Museum or the Natural History Museum. I was always there, it seemed like. Because every time you go to a room that you didn't see before. But most people don't do that. I can give you an example of how guilty I am of this. I was born in North Dakota, but I grew up in my childhood years in Miami, Florida. I never visited the Everglades until I moved away. And so, it's just the nature of what's close by. It doesn't seem to have that same excitement of what's things that seem farther away.
Yeah, it's an interesting dynamic. It is an interesting dynamic, and I hear you. Okay, cool. I know we're coming on the time. Yes, we're coming on the time. Maybe you could just sort of summarize this.
That section, that the summarize. It's a wonderful little lexicon of all the major words associated with beekeeping and how it would be used. And it's incredible when you go through this. It has to do with the what words are associated with bees and how you can tell the difference between the noun for bee versus the noun for honey. In particular, you'll notice there's a royal. We're looking at the royal titulary, which is the honeybee, the sedge plant, the two half circles, which is the letter T. But you take the bee and replace the other three items with a cylinder seal, and now you have the sealer of the king of Lower Egypt. That would be an individual who would take stock of what's being turned in for tribute. It'd be a ranking individual. You take the honeybee, that half circle, add a line to it, and you've got the word for bee. You add a vessel to that word for bee, and two more lines, and you've got the word for honey. And it's really cool. Unfortunately it's not on display, but if you go to page 73 of the book, you'll see in that circle in the middle there is a bee, there is a half circle, 3 lines, and a small vessel down in the corner. You could look at that stela, and you know, honey was one of the offerings that was given.
Mm-hmm.
And so what's really kind of cool about all this is to recognize, for me at least, I'm focusing on beekeeping. Just a few. So you look for the honeybee, and then what is it associated with it? What most of the time it's going to be the royal titulary. But if you see that seal, that's going to be a title. If you see a jar right next door to it, adjacent to it, you know we're going to be talking about honey somewhere. And so it's if you're focused like I am, let's face it, is a parochial focus. I'm focused on beekeeping in ancient Egypt. That's pretty. that's a relatively narrow subject for a lot of people. But then you've got clues. You see that bee, and once you start looking for it, it's everywhere.
Yeah, I imagine so, and I see that. Well, you've demonstrated that, and so I really, that's why I really appreciate the way you've laid out these kind of keys, as you put it there. And we didn't touch on the way the Rosetta Stone worked, and you touched on some things for this. So I think we've come to a good summary point now. Thank you so much for sharing that insight, those insights around the hieroglyphs.
Oh, well, you're welcome. It was a lot of fun.
Yes, it is, and because we've got common interests, and so there's so many different intersections for this. And I'm looking forward to our final conversation, and I know that our listeners they are looking forward to it. For most people, ancient Egypt is a kind of mysterious place. So one, the script is obviously not easy to read for most people. But then for me, the fact that most people can't get to go there, especially with the troubles that have been in Egypt over recent years, that puts people even further away from just visiting. So it's good to hear from someone who's been there many times and knows the space physically like that, and obviously has put together a fantastic book. So
thank you
again. Thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to the next conversation. And
as do I.
Kritsky, thank you.
That's it.
Okay, take care.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Level being 9, more detail mastery. On our level being level 9, mastery program. Detail on level being 9, mastery program. Wow! Mastery program. Level being 9, mastery.